Survival instructor listed toxic plants. Humans said, we spice food with those. The alarm in my ear cut through everything else. 3 life signs spiking at once, deep in the eastern ridge of the training zone, and one of them was climbing so fast I thought my scanner had broken. My name is Vantor Kess, and I have run survival drills for 11 cycles. I have watched recruits panic, freeze, collapse, and sometimes do everything right and still fail because the planet simply did not care about their training. I thought I had seen every kind of reaction a body could have out there. That belief lasted exactly as long as it took me to pull up the feed from Sector 4. 3 recruits were pinned against a rock wall, a storm front rolling in fast behind them, and the readings on my console did not make sense. 2 of them, a Threll cadet named Sella and a Barrow-born recruit called Onyx, showed the exact panic signature I expected: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, the classic fear spike before a survival failure. But the 3rd reading, from the human recruit, showed something my system had never logged before. His heart rate was up, yes, but steady. His stress hormones were rising in a pattern my computer flagged as active feeding behavior. Feeding behavior. During a Class 4 emergency, with a storm bearing down and no shelter in sight. I switched the feed to visual, and there he was. Ethan Cole, 23 years old, the only human in this cohort, kneeling at the base of the ridge with his hands full of leaves, not gripping them for balance, not using them as tools, eating them. I want to be clear about what those leaves were. I had personally written the hazard listing for that plant 3 seasons ago. Its sap carries a compound that shuts down the nerve signals of every species I have ever tested it on. 1 bite is enough to numb a Threll jaw for 6 hours. 2 bites and a Barrow recruit would lose feeling in both hands. I had labeled it, in bright red text on every recruit's field tablet, as lethal to ingest. Ethan Cole was chewing it like it was nothing. I keyed the comm open, my voice sharper than I intended. Cole, report your condition immediately. His answer came back calm, almost bored, like I had interrupted him doing something mundane. Fine, sir. Just needed something in my stomach before we move. This stuff's got a decent burn to it once you get past the first bite. A decent burn. I stared at the screen. Behind him, Sella was pressed flat against the rock, watching him with the same expression I imagine was on my own face. Onyx had backed away 3 full steps, as if the danger might be contagious. I told myself there had to be an error. A translation glitch, a scanner malfunction, something. I have trained recruits from 9 different worlds, and I know panic when I see it, and I know when someone is lying to sound brave in front of an instructor. This was neither. Cole's voice held no tremor. His hands were not shaking. He picked another leaf from the low bush beside him, folded it once, and ate it the way another recruit might eat a ration bar. "Cole," I said again, keeping my voice level, even though nothing about this felt level. "Do you understand what that plant does to a nervous system?" "Yeah," he said. "Numbs you right up if you eat too much. We call that one a nerve leaf back home. My grandmother used to put a pinch of the dried version in soup. Not a full handful like this, obviously, but a little makes your tongue go tingly in a good way. A good way." I repeated the words in my head because I needed to hear them again to believe he had actually said them. On my planet, on every world I have ever surveyed, a substance that shuts down nerve function is not folded into food for enjoyment. It is something you train recruits to identify from a distance and never touch. The storm was closing faster than my models predicted, gray clouds rolling low over the ridge, and I did not have time to sit with my confusion. I switched channels and pulled up the full Sector 4 feed, watching all 3 recruits at once. Sella and Onyx were doing exactly what the manual told them to do, searching for shelter, rationing their water, staying quiet to conserve energy. Textbook behavior, correct behavior. Cole was eating poison and grinning. "I need you 3 moving toward the ridge caves within 4 minutes, I said, forcing my voice back into instructor mode. "The storm front will reach your position in 6. Sella, take point. Onyx, watch our footing. Cole." I paused. I genuinely did not know what to tell him. Stop eating, that was the obvious order, but some part of me, the part that had spent 11 cycles cataloging danger, wanted to know more first. I settled on something safer. Cole, save the rest of that for later and move. Copy that, sir, he said, and to my continued disbelief, he pocketed a handful of the leaves before standing up. Pocketed them, like supplies. They started moving, and I switched my attention to the storm data, because that was still the immediate threat, and I could not let my confusion about one recruit's eating habits put all three of them at risk. The wind speed was climbing fast, gusts strong enough to knock a smaller recruit off balance on the loose rock. I traced the safest path to the caves and fed it to their tablets, watching the blue line update in real time as they climbed. Sella slipped once, catching herself on a jagged outcrop, and I heard her hiss in pain over the comm. Onyx reached back to steady her. Cole was already 3 steps ahead, moving with an ease that surprised me given how little of this terrain type existed on his homeworld according to his file. I keep every recruit's biological profile open during live drills, and I pulled his up again while they climbed, half hoping it would explain what I had just watched. Human physiology, standard entry, nothing flagged as unusual, no genetic modification, no enhanced tolerance markers. According to every metric my instruments could measure, Ethan Cole's body should have reacted to that plant exactly the way Sella's or Onyx's would have. It had not. The storm hit the ridge as they reached the mouth of the first cave, wind screaming across my audio feed loud enough that I had to lower the volume. Sella and Onyx scrambled inside first, breathing hard, and Cole followed a moment later, shaking rain off his jacket like it was an inconvenience rather than a threat. "Position secure," he reported. "Nice and dry in here. Thanks for the route, sir." I did not respond right away. I was still looking at the readout from 10 minutes earlier, the moment he had been eating a plant that should have put him in a medical bay. His vitals now, safely inside the cave, showed nothing unusual. No delayed reaction, no numbness creeping in. Whatever that plant had done to him, it had not been what the manual promised. I closed the feed and sat back, and for the first time in a long while, I did not have an immediate answer for what I had just witnessed. I had trained recruits from 9 worlds. I had written half the hazard listings myself, tested them, verified them, staked my reputation on their accuracy. And one human recruit had just eaten something I called lethal, called it a decent burn, and climbed a storm-lashed ridge without breaking a sweat. I pulled up the debrief schedule. The drill would end in 2 hours, once the storm passed and the recruits made their way back to base. I marked Cole's file for a private conversation immediately after, not as a disciplinary matter, though part of me wondered if it should be, but because I needed an explanation that made sense. The storm raged outside their shelter for the better part of an hour, and I monitored their vitals the entire time, watching Sella's heart rate slowly settle, watching Onyx ration the last of his water with visible restraint, and watching Cole, who at one point pulled out one of the pocketed leaves and ate it again, calm as anything, while the wind tried to tear the mountain apart outside. By the time the storm broke and the 3 of them made their way down from the ridge, tired and streaked with mud, but alive, I had already decided this was not something I could let go unexamined. Whatever I had just watched was not a fluke, not a translation error, not a scanner glitch. It was something about the human recruit himself, something no file I had access to could explain. I met them at the base gate as they came in. Sella and Onyx looked wrung out, the particular exhaustion of recruits who had just survived something they were not sure they would survive. Cole looked like he had gone for a brisk walk. "Good work out there," I told all 3 of them, and I meant it. Then I turned to Cole. "A word when you are settled." He nodded easily, no hesitation, no worry in his expression, and headed toward the barracks with the others. I watched him go, turning over everything I had seen that afternoon, and one thought settled over the rest, refusing to move. Whatever answer he gave me, I had a feeling it was going to change how I understood every hazard listing I had ever written. I found him 20 minutes later in the equipment bay, cleaning mud off his boots, with the same unhurried calm he had shown on the ridge. The bay was mostly empty at that hour, just the two of us and the hum of the ventilation system, which suited me. I did not want an audience for this conversation until I understood it myself. "Cole," I said, closing the door behind me, "walk me through what happened at the ridge." He set his boots down and looked at me with an expression I was starting to recognize, the one that meant he genuinely did not think he had done anything strange. Sure, storm was coming in, we needed to keep moving, and I hadn't eaten since breakfast. Saw the nerve leaf growing along the rock and figured I'd grab some. Kept my energy up for the climb. "You are aware that plant is listed as lethal," I said. "I wrote that listing myself. I have watched it disable a threll jaw for 6 hours from a single bite." "Yeah," he said, and to his credit he did not sound dismissive, more curious than anything. "It'll do that to y'all, I guess. Doesn't do much to us besides make your mouth tingle. My grandmother used a dried version of something close to it back home, sprinkled a pinch into broth on cold nights. Not the raw stuff, obviously, that would be pretty strong even for a person, but a little bit cooked down is fine." I sat down on the bench across from him because I needed a moment to process that sentence. A pinch. Cooked down. Fine. Every word he used to describe a compound I had tested on 3 separate species and classified as an active nerve toxin sounded like he was describing a recipe rather than a hazard. "Explain fine to me," I said, "because on my scale, fine means a body suffers no adverse effect whatsoever. Your vitals showed elevated stress markers consistent with active toxin processing. Your body knew something was wrong. It simply did not stop you." Cole thought about that for a second, actually thought about it, which I appreciated. That's probably about right. It does something, burns a little going down, sometimes gives you a headache if you eat too much too fast. But it's not going to put me in a hospital bed. Humans have been eating things like that for a long time. Longer than anybody remembers, probably. I want you to understand something about my reaction in that moment. I had spent 11 cycles building a body of knowledge about what was safe and what was not, testing plants against multiple species, calibrating hazard thresholds down to precise measurements. And here was a 23-year-old recruit telling me that an entire category of my classifications simply did not apply to his species, as if that were an obvious fact I should have already known. "Give me an example," I said. "Something beyond the leaf, something you would consider ordinary." He leaned back against the equipment locker, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely engaged, like I had finally asked a question he wanted to answer. "There's a root back home, real common one, grows almost everywhere. Raw, it'll make you seriously sick, mess with your nervous system pretty bad if you eat enough of it. But you cook it right, process it a certain way, and it becomes one of the main things a huge part of the world eats every single day. Whole regions depend on it. Same plant, same compound in it. We just figured out how to make it safe enough to matter, and then kept eating it anyway even when it wasn't perfectly safe, because it filled you up and it grew easy." I stared at him. "You are telling me your species deliberately continued eating something dangerous, generation after generation, because it was convenient?" "More or less, yeah. And then there's stuff we eat specifically because it hurts a little. There's a whole category of plant back home, dozens of different kinds, that make your mouth burn like it's on fire. Not a metaphor, it genuinely feels like heat, even though there's no actual temperature change happening. People grow entire fields of the stuff on purpose, compete over who can handle the strongest ones. Put it on food to make the food more interesting." "Why?" I asked, and I heard the genuine confusion in my own voice. Why would any species choose pain as a feature of their food? He shrugged, an easy human gesture I had seen 100 times without ever understanding it fully until that moment. "Honestly, because it feels good after. Something about how the body reacts to it. Little bit of the same rush you'd get from doing something risky, except you can get it from a meal, and it wakes you up, keeps food from going bad as fast in hot places, works as a kind of built-in preservative too. Started out probably as necessity, somewhere back in our history, and turned into something people just like now." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way I would turn over any new piece of survival data, except nothing about it fit cleanly into the categories I understood. On every world I had surveyed, danger was danger. A toxin was a toxin. A species either tolerated a compound or it did not, and if it did not, that compound stayed on the hazard list permanently, an unmovable boundary between what could be eaten and what could kill you. Humans, apparently, had looked at that boundary and decided it was more of a suggestion. I need to run a controlled comparison, I told him, standing up. Tomorrow, in the field lab, with proper monitoring equipment this time, instead of a field scanner during a live storm drill. I want to understand the actual range of what your body can process. And I want data, not stories. Cole grinned, and there was nothing nervous about it. Sounds fair. Fair warning, though. I'm probably going to enjoy this more than you expect me to. I did not sleep well that night. I kept pulling up old hazard files on my personal terminal, cross-referencing plants I had spent years cataloging, wondering how many of them a human would simply describe as flavorful. It was an unsettling thought for someone whose entire profession rested on the idea that danger could be measured, listed, and taught with confidence. If an entire species existed, whose bodies simply refused to follow the rules I had built my career around, then what exactly had I been teaching all this time? The next morning, I arranged the field lab exactly the way I wanted it. Full biometric monitoring, 3 separate scanners cross-checked against each other so there could be no room for equipment error, and a containment barrier between the testing table and the rest of the room in case something went wrong that I had not anticipated. I also, against my better judgment, invited 2 other instructors to observe, Instructor Marlon Reese, who had trained recruits nearly as long as I had, and Dr. Priya Nair, our staff physician, who I suspected would need to be there regardless once she saw what I intended to test. Both of them arrived skeptical. Reese in particular crossed his arms the moment I explained what we were doing. "You want to feed a recruit compounds from the hazard index," he said, "on purpose, in a controlled setting, because he claims his species eats them for enjoyment." "That is exactly what I want to do," I said, "and I want you here to confirm I am not imagining what I saw yesterday." Dr. Nair, at least, looked intrigued rather than doubtful. If his physiology genuinely processes these compounds differently, that's worth documenting properly. I'll want full blood work before and after each sample. Cole arrived a few minutes later, freshly showered, looking entirely too relaxed for someone about to eat a table full of substances classified as dangerous. He glanced at the containment barrier and the row of scanners with something like amusement. "This is a lot of equipment for lunch," he said. "This is not lunch," I told him, though even as I said it I understood that for him, functionally, it might as well have been. "Sit. We begin with the mildest sample and work upward. Any adverse reaction, any at all, and we stop immediately." "Understood, sir," he said, and sat down across from the containment barrier with the calm posture of someone settling in for a meal at a familiar table rather than a scientific trial. I laid out the first sample myself, a small portion of dried bark from a tree native to the southern hazard zone, one that caused mild but persistent skin irritation in every species I had tested it on when ingested, along with digestive distress that could last for days. Dr. Nair attached the monitoring leads to Cole's arm and chest, her expression carefully neutral, though I could see her watching the scanner readout as closely as I was. "Whenever you're ready," I said. Cole picked up the bark, turned it over once, and ate it without ceremony, the way another person might eat a piece of dried meat. I watched the scanners. His heart rate ticked up slightly, a normal response to any new stimulus, and then settled within a minute. No digestive distress markers, no irritation signature, nothing. "Bit dry," he said. "Needs salt. This one's not bad though, kind of like chewing on tree bark, which I guess it literally is." Reese, standing near the door, had gone very quiet. I moved to the second sample, then the third. Each one, according to my own listings, should have produced some measurable adverse reaction, ranging from mild to severe, depending on quantity. Each one, Cole ate with the same unbothered attitude, occasionally offering commentary that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with taste. Bit bitter. Needs something sweet with it. This one's actually pretty good, kind of smoky. Reminds me of something my neighbor used to make. By the fourth sample, Dr. Nair had stopped looking surprised and started looking fascinated, cross-referencing his blood work against baseline readings with the focused intensity of someone who had just found a genuinely new field of study. His liver enzyme activity is elevated across the board, she said, mostly to herself, but not in a way that suggests damage. It's more like his body is simply built to process a wider range of compounds as a matter of course. Like this is the expected baseline for a human, not a stress response. We reached the fifth sample, the one I had personally been most curious and most nervous about, a small red pod from a plant that produced a compound so potent I had once watched a Barrow recruit accidentally brush against the plant's oils and require medical treatment for the resulting burn on contact alone. I had never tested ingestion on any species, because ingestion had never seemed like something any rational being would attempt. I set it on the table and hesitated before pushing it toward him. This one I am less certain about, I admitted. Contact alone has caused significant reactions in other species. I do not have ingestion data for anyone. Cole picked it up, turned it over between his fingers, and to my genuine alarm, smiled. "Oh, I know this one," he said. "Sort of. Not exactly the same plant, but close enough. We've got a whole family of these back home. This is basically a pepper." "A pepper," I repeated. "Yeah, we grow these things on purpose. There's competitions for who can eat the hottest ones without stopping." He popped it into his mouth before I could object, chewed twice, and his eyes widened, though not with alarm. "That is a good one." "Whew. Okay. That's got some real heat to it." His face had flushed noticeably, sweat beading along his hairline, and for a moment my instincts screamed that this was exactly the reaction I had been trained to watch for, the early signature of a body in crisis. But Dr. Nair's scanner told a different story. Elevated heart rate, yes. Elevated body temperature, yes. But no toxin markers building in his bloodstream, no organ stress, nothing that resembled the emergency I expected. "He's fine," Dr. Nair said, sounding almost delighted by how strange that sentence was to say. "Physiologically, this is closer to what happens during moderate exercise than what happens during a toxic exposure. His body is treating this as a sensory experience, not a threat." Cole reached for a cup of water, drank it, and grinned at all three of us, his eyes still a little watery. "Told you. We put stuff like this on wings, on eggs, in soup, basically anywhere we want a little kick. Some people can't handle the really strong ones, but plenty of us actively look for the strongest kind we can find. It's kind of a whole thing back home." Reese finally spoke from the doorway, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone whose entire professional framework had just been quietly dismantled in front of him. 11 cycles, he said. 11 cycles of hazard training, built on the assumption that toxicity is a universal constant, and it turns out one species just decided some of it was seasoning. I did not have a response for him, because I was thinking the exact same thing, and I was starting to suspect this was only the beginning of what I did not yet understand about the recruit sitting calmly across from me, wiping sweat from his forehead and asking, with genuine curiosity, whether we had anything sweet to go with the next sample. 3 days later, Command approved an advanced field exercise in the lowland marsh, a section of terrain we normally reserved for senior recruits because of its unpredictable wildlife and dense, disorienting fog banks. I had requested Cole be included, along with Sella and Onyx, and a new recruit named Grace Bennett who had transferred in from a survival program on a colder world and had a reputation for excellent instincts under pressure. I told myself the request was purely professional, that I needed more data points in a live environment. Dr. Nair, when she signed off on the medical clearance, gave me a look that suggested she did not entirely believe that explanation, and honestly, neither did I. The marsh exercise was meant to run 4 hours. Locate a supply cache, Navigate the fog without instruments. Avoid 3 specific predator species known to hunt in that terrain, and return to the extraction point before dusk. Standard difficulty for the level. Nothing about it should have gone wrong. It went wrong 40 minutes in. I was monitoring from the command tent at the marsh's edge, watching 4 life sign trackers move steadily through the fog on my display, when Onyx's marker suddenly spiked into the red. Not the panic spike I had seen from him before. This was different, a sharp, jagged pattern that my system immediately flagged as a toxin exposure alert. I opened the comm channel so fast I nearly dropped the unit. Team, report. Onyx, what happened? There was a pause, filled with static and the distant sound of splashing water, and then Sella's voice came through, tight with fear. He stepped in something, one of the marsh flowers. It sprayed when his boot crushed it, got on his hands and his face before he could get clear. He's having trouble breathing. I was already pulling up the hazard listing for that section of marsh, my hands moving faster than my thoughts. The flower she meant was one I knew well, a low-growing plant with wide white petals that released a fine mist of toxin when disturbed, a defense mechanism against grazing animals. On contact with skin, it caused swelling. On contact with mucous membranes, which Onyx's face had clearly suffered, it caused airway constriction severe enough to be fatal within the hour if untreated. Get him to open ground, away from the flower bed, I ordered, already moving toward the medical kit stored at the command tent, though I knew from the map that I was at least 20 minutes from their position on foot, and the marsh terrain would slow any vehicle to a crawl. Dr. Nair, I need you in the field, now. She was already grabbing her kit as I said it, but even at full speed, we were not going to reach them in time. Onyx's marker on my display was still climbing into dangerous territory, his breathing rate erratic, his oxygen saturation beginning to drop according to the field monitor built into his suit. Cole's voice cut through the calm in a way that should have been impossible given the situation, but which I had come to recognize as simply how he sounded under pressure. Sir, I need you to pull up the plant listing again, fast. Does the flower's toxin have an acid or an alkaline base, do you know? I scrambled through the file, my hands shaking slightly, an admission I would not have made to anyone but myself in that moment. Alkaline, I said. Mild alkaline compound disrupts smooth muscle function on contact. Okay, good, that's good, he said, and I heard movement over the comm, fast and purposeful. Grace, help me here. Sella, keep him upright, don't let him lie flat. It'll make the airway thing worse. What are you doing? I demanded, watching his marker on the display moving away from the group, toward a denser patch of marsh vegetation, rather than away from danger the way every instinct in my training told him to move. There's a plant out here. Low, spiky leaves, purple stem, real common in wet ground like this, he said, his voice slightly breathless now but still steady. Back home we've got something almost identical, grows in similar conditions. It's got a mild acid in the sap. People used to chew it for stomach trouble, but it also works on stings and rashes from certain plants because the acid neutralizes the alkaline stuff. I'm not 100% sure it's the same compound here, but the marsh conditions and the leaf structure are close enough that I think it's worth trying. I stared at my display, at Onyx's oxygen levels continuing to drop, and I understood in that instant that I had no better option to offer. Every protocol in my training told me the correct response to toxin exposure was evacuation and professional medical treatment, not field improvisation with an unverified plant based on a recruit's memory of something similar from an entirely different planet. But professional medical treatment was 20 minutes away, and Onyx did not have 20 minutes. Do it, I said, and I have never in 11 cycles given an order with less certainty behind it. The comm was quiet for a long, agonizing stretch, filled only with the sound of Sella's frightened breathing and Onyx's labored gasps in the background. Then Cole's voice again, quieter, focused. Got it. Grace, crush these up. We need the sap, not the whole leaf. Sella, tilt his head back a little. I need to get this on the skin around his mouth and nose first. That's where the reaction's worst. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, watching 4 dots on a display, unable to do anything but wait and hope that a recollection from a human recruit's childhood, applied to an alien plant on an alien marsh, would somehow work the way he thought it would. It was the single most powerless I had felt in 11 cycles of teaching survival, and the irony of that was not lost on me even as it was happening. Onyx's marker steadied. It did not drop back to normal immediately, and for a moment I thought I had imagined the change, but Dr. Nair, still moving through the marsh toward them, confirmed it over the comm a few seconds later. His oxygen saturation is climbing. Whatever you did, Cole, it's working. Keep it up. I felt something in my chest loosen that I had not realized was tight. Over the following 10 minutes, which felt considerably longer, Cole and Grace worked together, applying the crushed plant sap to the affected areas of Onyx's skin, while Sella kept him upright and talking, and by the time Dr. Nair reached them, breathless from the run through the marsh, Onyx was breathing on his own, weakly but steadily, his swelling visibly reduced. "I need to get him to the medical bay regardless," Dr. Nair said, checking his vitals with practiced hands. "This bought us time, but I want him properly treated and observed. Good work, all of you." I made my way through the marsh myself at that point, no longer content to direct from the command tent, and reached them just as Dr. Nair was preparing Onyx for transport on a field stretcher. He was pale, clearly exhausted, but conscious and lucid, which 20 minutes earlier had not been guaranteed. Cole was sitting nearby, hands still faintly stained purple from the crushed plant, looking more shaken than he had at any point during the toxicity trial in the lab. I understood why. Eating something dangerous by choice, in a controlled setting, was one kind of risk. Making a split-second decision about someone else's life, based on a plant he had only half recognized from a different world entirely, was another kind altogether. "How did you know?" I asked him quietly, once Dr. Nair and the others had moved off toward the extraction point with the stretcher. "That the plant would work. You could not have been certain." "I wasn't," he admitted, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely uncertain, the confidence from the lab replaced by something rawer. "I had maybe 60% confidence it would help and not hurt. But we didn't have 20 minutes, and I've grown up around plants my whole life, back home, in gardens and on hikes, and just paying attention to what things looked like and what they did. That's kind of just normal where I'm from. Everybody's got at least a little bit of that knowledge, even people who never leave the city. It's baked into how we grow up." "Baked in," I repeated. "Yeah. Like we don't just eat dangerous stuff for fun, even though I know that's what it looks like from the outside. We spent thousands of years figuring out exactly which dangerous things could be turned into food, and which dangerous things could be turned into medicine, and which ones just needed to stay dangerous and left alone. It's not random. There's a whole body of knowledge behind it, passed down, tested over and over by people way smarter than me. I just happened to remember bits of it." I sat with that for a moment, watching Sella check on Onyx from a respectful distance, watching Grace wash the purple stain from her hands in a nearby stream, watching the fog begin to lift slightly as the sun climbed higher. I thought about every hazard listing I had ever written, every boundary I had drawn between safe and dangerous, and I thought about how confidently I had taught those boundaries to recruits from 9 different worlds, never once suspecting that an entire species existed whose relationship with danger was so fundamentally different from anything I understood. "We are not finished with the extraction," I said finally, because there was still a job to do and a marsh full of unknown hazards between us and the extraction point, and Onyx's medical emergency did not change that reality. "Sella, Grace, status report. We move in 5 minutes." But even as I gave the order, part of my mind was still turning over what Cole had said, a body of knowledge, tested over thousands of years, passed down through generations, distinguishing between what could kill and what could heal and what could simply make a meal more interesting. It was not recklessness at all, I realized. It was something closer to the opposite. It was expertise so old and so thoroughly absorbed into the culture that it no longer looked like expertise from the outside. It looked like instinct. It looked, to someone like me, like a species with no fear of danger at all. I had been wrong about that, and I intended to find out exactly how wrong before this exercise concluded. We had not gone far before the marsh threw another problem at us. The ground gave way to a wide channel of dark water, far too deep to wade and far too broad to jump, cutting straight across the only path back to the extraction point that our maps showed as passable before nightfall. Sella tested the current with a length of salvaged cord and reported it stronger than it looked, strong enough to sweep a fully grown recruit off their feet within a few strides. "We backtrack," I said, already recalculating the route in my head, aware that backtracking meant losing nearly 2 hours we did not comfortably have before the extraction window closed. "Wait," Cole said, crouching at the water's edge, studying something along the bank I had not even noticed, a cluster of tall, hollow reeds growing thick in the shallows. "These are buoyant. Really buoyant, actually, if the structure's what I think it is. Back home we used reeds almost exactly like this to make quick rafts when we needed to cross rivers fast during survival courses. Cut enough of them, bundle them tight, and they'll hold weight far longer than you'd expect for something this light. You want to build a raft, in under an hour, out of a plant none of us have ever tested," I said, and I heard the doubt in my own voice even as I said it. "I want to test one bundle first, with no one on it, before anybody trusts their life to it," he said. "If it sinks, we backtrack and lose the time. If it floats, we might just save ourselves those 2 hours." There was no better plan on offer, so we spent the next 20 minutes cutting reeds under Cole's direction, binding them into a tight raft using cord from the salvage kit, while Grace kept watch on the tree line, and Sella monitored the current for any change. The test bundle, weighted with a pack full of gear, floated exactly as Cole had predicted, riding low but stable in the dark water. We crossed in pairs, Cole first with Grace to prove the design could hold 2, then Sella and myself, the current dragging at the raft harder than I expected, but never close to overturning it. By the time we reached the far bank, soaked to the knees but otherwise unharmed, I found myself doing something I rarely did during an active exercise, which was simply standing still for a moment, letting the relief of a crisis avoided settle over me before we pressed on. "That should not have worked," I told Cole honestly, as we gathered ourselves for the final stretch toward the extraction point. "Most of the time it just doesn't," he admitted, wringing water from his sleeve. "But you learn the difference between a plant that might save you and a plant that's just pretty to look at, and eventually you start trusting your own read on it. Doesn't mean I'm always right, means I'm usually right enough to be worth the gamble when the alternative is worse." The walk to the extraction point took the better part of an hour after that, the fog finally burning away under the midday sun, revealing a marsh landscape thick with the very plants I had spent years cataloging as threats. I found myself looking at them differently now, wondering how many of them Cole could identify, not as hazards, but as remedies, as food, as something his species had already quietly conquered, while the rest of us had simply learned to avoid. When we reached the extraction point, the transport already waiting with Onyx stable inside, resting under Dr. Nair's watchful care, Cole fell into step beside me without being asked. "For what it's worth," he said, "you made the right call back there. Trusting me on the plant, I mean. That couldn't have been easy." "It was the hardest decision I have made in 11 cycles," I told him honestly, because there was no reason to pretend otherwise at this point. I am beginning to think my understanding of what constitutes danger has been incomplete for a very long time. He smiled, tired but genuine. Everybody's is, until somebody from somewhere else shows them different. That's kind of the whole point of doing this stuff together, right? Nobody's got the full picture on their own. I did not have an answer for that immediately, but I found, as we boarded the transport and left the marsh behind us, that I agreed with him more than I was entirely comfortable admitting. Onyx recovered fully within 2 days, and Command, after reviewing the incident report, requested a full audit of the marsh training zone's hazard listings, along with a formal review of what they called an unusual medical intervention. I spent that evening in the archive wing instead of my quarters, pulling every record I could find on human dietary history, because I needed to understand the scale of what I had witnessed before I tried to explain it to anyone above my pay grade. What I found kept me there until well past midnight. Human agricultural records, once I knew what to search for, were staggering in their scope. An entire staple food crop, grown across a significant portion of their homeworld, that was toxic in its raw form and required a specific multi-step process of peeling, soaking, and cooking to become safe. Millions of people, across thousands of years, relying on a plant that could genuinely harm them if prepared incorrectly, simply because someone, generations ago, had figured out the process and passed it down until it became ordinary knowledge, taught to children the way we taught recruits to identify a predator's tracks. There was more. A fermented beverage made from grain, consumed recreationally across nearly every human culture I found records of, despite clear documentation of its capacity to impair judgment and damage organs with regular use. A bitter seed, toxic and unpalatable in its raw state, that humans had spent centuries refining into something they turned into a sweet treat, celebrated across their entire species, given as gifts, associated with affection and celebration. Root vegetables that carried mild neurotoxins when green or improperly stored, eaten daily in some regions with barely a second thought given to the risk, because the risk was so well understood and so thoroughly managed that it had stopped registering as risk at all. I kept searching, because once I had started I found I could not make myself stop. I found records of an entire class of dried leaves that humans steeped in hot water and drank every single day, a mild stimulant compound running through nearly every human culture I could find data on, consumed so routinely that it barely registered in their records as a substance at all, simply a habit, a comfort, a shared ritual repeated billions of times across their homeworld, without a second thought given to the fact that in sufficient quantity, that same compound could quicken a heart to dangerous levels. I found records of preserved meats, cured for months using salt and smoke and thyme, techniques developed specifically to hold off the kind of decay that would sicken or kill in any other context, turned instead into prized delicacies passed between generations like heirlooms. I found records of a fungus, distinct from any I had trained recruits to identify and avoid, that humans had learned to distinguish with such precision between its edible and its lethal varieties, that entire seasons of their calendar were built around harvesting it safely, a tradition so old that some of their historical records described it in near-reverent terms, an entire culture built around correctly reading the difference between food and death growing from the same patch of forest floor. I sat back from the terminal at one point and simply stared at the wall for a while, trying to reconcile what I was reading with everything I thought I understood about danger and survival. On every world I had trained recruits from, danger was something to be identified, avoided, and taught as an unmovable boundary. Humans, it seemed, treated danger as a puzzle to be solved, generation after generation, until the solution became so deeply woven into their culture that it stopped looking like courage and started looking like a recipe. I was still in the archive when Dr. Nair found me, carrying 2 cups of something warm, and set one down in front of me without asking if I wanted it. "You look like someone who has not slept," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I have not," I admitted. "I am trying to understand how an entire species built its culture around what I would call an unreasonable relationship with danger, and I keep finding more examples instead of fewer." She glanced at my terminal, scanning the open records, and nodded slowly. "I pulled some of his medical history myself, out of curiosity, after the Marsh incident. His body has markers I have never seen in any other species profile, enzyme systems that seem built specifically to break down a wider range of compounds than most species even encounter in their environment. It is not that humans are simply braver, from what I can tell. Their bodies genuinely process danger differently, but that does not fully explain the leaf, or the root, or any of it, because plenty of what they eat should still cause harm even accounting for that difference." "I think it is both things at once," I said, thinking aloud as much as answering her. Their bodies process certain toxins more efficiently than ours do, which explains part of what I saw. But the rest of it, the deliberate cultivation, the recipes passed down through generations, the choice to keep eating something dangerous, specifically because it tastes interesting, rather than because they had no other food, that is not physiology. That is culture. That is a species that looked at the boundary between safe and dangerous and decided the boundary was worth pushing, over and over, until pushing it became normal. Dr. Nair was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands. It makes me wonder what else we have gotten wrong. Treating every species like their relationship with the physical world follows the same rules ours does. I did not have time to answer her, because that was the exact moment the alert klaxon sounded through the base. 3 sharp pulses that meant a facility-wide emergency, not a training exercise. We were both on our feet immediately, moving toward the command center, and by the time we arrived, the situation was already being relayed across every channel. A contamination event in the primary water reclamation system, the same system that fed both the base's drinking water and a significant portion of the food preparation facilities. Early readings suggested an unfamiliar compound had entered the system through a filtration breach, and the base's automated hazard detection had flagged it immediately, triggering an emergency lockdown of the mess hall and all connected water lines before anyone had actually consumed anything. Small mercies, but the problem remained. Nearly 400 personnel on base, no confirmed safe water source, and a compound the automated system could not identify, which meant it could not tell us whether it was merely unpleasant or genuinely lethal. I need identification on that compound before anyone authorizes emergency rationing from backup supplies, the facility director said over the command channel, her voice tight with the particular stress of someone managing a crisis with incomplete information. Lab is running analysis now, but full identification could take hours we may not have if backup supplies run short. I found myself glancing toward Dr. Nair, and I could see the same thought forming behind her eyes that had formed behind mine. I keyed my comm before I had fully decided to do it. "Get me coal," I said, immediately. The facility director's voice came back sharp with confusion. "Instructor Kess, this is a contamination crisis, not a training exercise. I do not have time for—" "I understand the situation entirely," I said, cutting her off with more force than I typically used with superior officers, but the moment felt like it demanded it. The recruit in question has demonstrated repeated, verified ability to identify plant-based compounds and their properties faster than our standard lab analysis, including in a live medical emergency 2 days ago that is already in your incident reports. If this contamination originated from an organic source, and preliminary readings suggest exactly that, he may be able to give us a working identification while the lab confirms it properly." There was a pause, and then, reluctantly, an order relayed to bring Cole to the command center. He arrived within minutes, still in his training gear, looking more alert than anyone should look at that hour of the night. I handed him the preliminary sensor readout the moment he walked in, watching him scan it with the same focused attention I had seen him apply to the samples in Dr. Nair's lab days earlier. "Organic compound, plant-derived, entered through the western filtration intake," I said, giving him what little we knew. "Automated systems cannot fully identify it. We need to know if it is dangerous, and if so, how dangerous, before we make decisions about the water supply for 400 people." He studied the readout for a long moment, his expression shifting from alertness to something more focused, more serious than I had seen from him even during the Marsh crisis. "Can I see the molecular breakdown, not just the summary?" I pulled it up for him immediately, and he leaned over the display, tracing certain elements of the structure with a finger, muttering something to himself that I did not fully catch. After a moment, he straightened. "This looks a lot like a compound from a family of water plants back home," he said. "Not exact, but the structure's close enough that I'd bet on it. If it's what I think it is, it causes stomach problems, dehydration, that kind of thing, if you drink a lot of it. Nasty, but not usually fatal unless someone's already vulnerable, like very young, very old, or already sick." It is not going to be safe to drink long-term untreated, but it is also not the kind of thing that kills someone in one glass. The facility director, listening on the open channel, spoke immediately. That is a considerable difference from what the automated system implied. Can you be certain enough for me to adjust emergency protocols? Cole hesitated, and I appreciated that hesitation more than I could have said, because it told me he understood the weight of what he was being asked. I would want the lab to confirm before anybody actually drinks it again, he said carefully. But for planning purposes, for how urgently you need those backup supplies rationed tonight versus having a few hours to sort this properly, I would treat this as serious but not an immediate lethal threat. That should buy your team's time to fix the filtration breach and confirm everything the right way, instead of everyone panicking and draining the backup tanks in the next hour. The director exhaled audibly over the comm, and I could hear the tension easing slightly in her voice even through the speaker. That is exactly the kind of information I needed. Thank you, recruit. Lab, prioritize confirmation on the compound Cole just flagged. Treat it as the working hypothesis. Over the following 2 hours, the lab's full analysis confirmed almost exactly what Cole had assessed from a molecular readout in under 10 minutes. The filtration breach was sealed, backup supplies rationed sensibly rather than in a panic, and by the time the sun rose over the base, the crisis had been managed without a single serious injury, largely because one recruit's strange, encyclopedic, almost inherited relationship with dangerous plants had turned a guessing game into a confident plan. I found Cole afterward, sitting alone outside the command center, watching the sunrise, with the particular exhaustion of someone running on adrenaline rather than rest. You saved us hours tonight, I told him, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation. Possibly more than hours, if that compound had built up in enough people before the lab finished its own analysis. He shrugged, though I could tell the compliment landed somewhere real underneath the casual gesture. Just pattern matching, honestly. My grandmother taught me to identify half the plants growing wild near our house before I was 10 years old, which ones you could eat, which ones you could use for medicine, which ones you left alone completely. I never thought any of that would matter out here, on a completely different planet, with completely different plants. Guess some things just carry over more than you'd expect. I have spent this entire week revising everything I understood about danger, I admitted, watching the light spread slowly across the base. I built my career on the idea that hazard is a fixed, measurable thing, true for every species in the same way. I am beginning to think that was never entirely true, and that your species simply proved it faster and more thoroughly than anyone else I have trained. Cole smiled, tired but genuine, watching the sun climb higher over the horizon. Maybe hazard's not fixed at all, he said. Maybe it's just a conversation between what's out there and who's eating it. And we've just been having that conversation a really, really long time. I did not have an answer for that immediately, but I found myself, for the first time in 11 cycles, genuinely looking forward to whatever the next lesson would teach me. 3 weeks later, the final graduation exercise for Cole's cohort took us to a moon designated only by a survey number, chosen specifically because its terrain and biology had never been used in a training scenario before. Command wanted a genuine test, unknown hazards instead of cataloged ones, and I had argued successfully to be the lead instructor on the ground rather than monitoring from a command tent, because after everything I had learned that season, I no longer trusted myself to make good decisions from a distance. The transport shuttle carrying Sella, Onyx, Grace, Cole, and myself was 3 minutes from our designated landing zone when the moon's upper atmosphere did something our survey data had not predicted. The first warning was a violent shudder through the hull, followed immediately by an alarm I recognized instantly and hated hearing. Electromagnetic disruption, the pilot called back over the comm, her voice controlled but urgent. Something in the atmosphere up here is interfering with our navigation, and half our instruments. I'm losing altitude control. We need to set down now, not at the landing zone, wherever I can find flat ground. The next 90 seconds passed in the particular blur that only genuine emergencies produce. A compression of time where everything happens both too fast to process and too slowly to escape. I remember bracing against the restraints. I remember Grace's hand gripping the seat beside her hard enough to whiten her knuckles. I remember Cole, beside me, not gripping anything at all, watching the chaos outside the viewport with an expression of focused calm that I found, in that moment, strangely steadying. The landing was not gentle. The shuttle clipped something on the way down, a rock formation or a tree, I never found out which, and we came to rest at an angle steep enough that we had to climb, rather than walk out of the wreckage, once the pilot confirmed we were down and stable enough to move. I did a head count the moment my feet hit solid ground, my training overriding the ringing in my ears and the ache in my shoulder where the restraint had bitten hard during impact. Sela, present, favoring one leg but upright. Onyx, present, a cut above his eyebrow but otherwise unhurt. Grace, present, pale but steady. Cole, present, already moving toward the pilot to help her out of the cockpit, which had taken the worst of the impact. The pilot, a thrall named Corvin Ash, was conscious but injured, a fractured leg that made walking impossible without support, and her communications console had taken enough damage in the crash that our distress signal was, according to her frantic diagnostics, transmitting on a severely degraded range. Rescue would come, eventually, once the base noticed we had missed our scheduled check-in, but eventually was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and none of us knew exactly how long eventually would take on a moon we had never surveyed properly. Surrounded by biology none of us had ever catalogued. "We need shelter, water, and a stronger signal," I said, taking stock of our situation with the part of my mind that had spent 11 cycles training for exactly this scenario, even if I had never expected to live through a version of it myself. Sela, Onyx, secure the wreckage and see what supplies survived intact. Grace, help me get Corvin stabilized and comfortable. Cole, I need to see what's actually out here before I can help with much else, he said, already moving toward the tree line a short distance from the crash site, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar vegetation with the same intensity I had watched him bring to every sample in the lab. If I'm going to be useful, I need to know what we're dealing with. Do not eat anything without confirming with me first, I called after him, and I heard him laugh, a short, genuine sound that felt strange and welcome in the middle of a crisis. Wouldn't dream of it, sir. Not until I know what I'm looking at. The following hours passed in the steady, exhausting rhythm of survival work. Sela and Onyx salvaged what they could from the wreckage, a partial medical kit, 2 working water purifiers, and enough emergency rations to last us perhaps 2 days if we were careful. Grace splinted Corvin's leg with quiet efficiency, drawing on training I suspected she rarely got to use outside of exactly this kind of emergency. I worked the damaged communications console alongside Corvin, trying and largely failing to boost our signal range using components never designed for the repair we were attempting. Cole returned as the moon's sun, a dim orange thing low on the horizon, began sinking toward what promised to be a long and dark night. He carried an armful of unfamiliar plants, his expression a careful mixture of caution and something almost like excitement. "Found a stream about 10 minutes that way," he reported, dropping the plants near our small camp. "Water tests clean on the purifier, which is good news. And there's a few things growing along the bank that I think are worth looking at closer, but I want your eyes on them before anyone touches them beyond looking." I examined what he had gathered by the fading light. A cluster of broad, waxy leaves with a faint blue tinge, a cluster of small, round berries the color of rust, a thick, fibrous stem with a distinctive ridge texture I did not recognize from any survey data I had ever reviewed, because none existed for this moon. "I do not know what any of these are," I admitted, which was not a sentence I enjoyed saying out loud in front of recruits, but honesty mattered more than pride in that particular moment. "My scanner can give us a basic compound breakdown, but without a matched database, it cannot tell us definitively whether they are safe." Cole crouched beside the plants, studying them with the same patience he had shown in every sample trial back at base. "The leaf structure on this one," he said, pointing to the waxy blue-tinged plant, reminds me a lot of a family of plants back home that store water in thick leaves like that, usually in dry environments. Those are almost always safe, sometimes even good for treating small burns or cuts if you use the inner gel. The berries, though, I'm less sure about. Rust-colored berries back home are a mixed bag. Some are fine, some will make you very sick. I wouldn't touch those without more information. And the stem? I asked. He turned it over in his hands, testing its flexibility, running a thumb along one of the ridges. Honestly, no idea. Never seen a structure quite like this. That's actually a good sign in a weird way. Means I'm not pattern matching off a false assumption. I'm just admitting I don't know. I'd leave it alone until we absolutely need to test something and have no better option. I found myself, in that moment, trusting his uncertainty as much as I had come to trust his confidence, because I understood now that both came from the same source, a genuine, deeply ingrained relationship with the natural world that did not pretend to know more than it did. We used the waxy leaves that night, their gel soothing the worst of Sella's bruising and a shallow cut Onyx had sustained during the crash, and we left the berries and the stem alone, exactly as Cole had advised. The night that followed was long and cold, and somewhere in its darkest hours, the real crisis of our situation arrived, not from the plants or the terrain, but from something moving through the trees beyond our small fire, something large enough to snap branches under its weight, patient enough to circle rather than charge. "Everyone up. Quiet," I said the moment I heard it, and every recruit responded instantly. No hesitation, no confusion, the exact discipline 11 cycles of training was meant to produce. "Corvin, stay near the fire. The rest of you, backs to the wreckage, weapons ready if you have them." We did not have proper weapons, only the modest tools that had survived the crash, a fact that felt considerably more frightening in that moment than it had at any point during the calm planning of our supply inventory. The sound in the trees circled closer, and through gaps in the underbrush I caught glimpses of something low and long-bodied, moving with the unmistakable patience of a predator assessing prey rather than a curious animal passing through. "It's testing us," Cole said quietly, standing beside me with his eyes fixed on the tree line, seeing if we're worth the effort of an attack. Predators back home do the same thing. Circle first. Look for weakness. An easy opening. "What do you suggest?" I asked, because in that moment, on unfamiliar ground, facing an unfamiliar threat, I trusted his instincts nearly as much as my own training. "We make ourselves look like more trouble than we're worth," he said. "Fire's good. Most things are wary of it. But if it charges, we need to look bigger and louder than we are, not smaller. Don't run. Running is what prey does." The creature made its decision a few minutes later, breaking from the tree line in a sudden, low charge that closed the distance between us far faster than I expected anything that size to move. What happened next unfolded in a chaos of noise and motion, all of us shouting, Sella swinging a length of salvaged metal, Onyx throwing a burning branch from the fire directly into the creature's path, and Cole, without hesitation, grabbing a handful of the rust-colored berries he had specifically warned us not to eat and hurling them directly at the creature's face as it lunged. The berries burst on impact, releasing a sharp, acrid smell that hit even from where I stood, and the creature recoiled violently, shaking its head, momentarily blinded or disoriented enough to break off its charge and retreat back toward the tree line, crashing through the underbrush until the sound of its movement faded into the darkness. For a long moment, none of us spoke, all of us breathing hard, watching the tree line for any sign it would return. "I thought you said you did not know what those berries would do," I finally said to Cole, once it became clear the immediate danger had passed. "I didn't know if they were safe to eat," he corrected, his voice a little unsteady with adrenaline. "But when I crushed a couple earlier while I was looking at them, they had this really sharp smell, almost like something that would irritate eyes or a nose on contact. Figured if I was wrong about it being edible, there was a decent chance I was right about it being unpleasant to get a face full of. Seemed worth the gamble given the alternative. Dr. Nair is going to want a full report on that decision-making process," I said, and despite everything, despite the cold and the danger and the very real possibility that the creature might return, I felt something that was almost laughter rising in my chest. We kept watch in shifts through the remainder of that night, and during my turn beside the fire, somewhere in the deepest, coldest hour before dawn, Cole sat up from where he had been resting and joined me without a word, apparently unable to sleep, despite the exhaustion I knew he had to be feeling. "You should rest while you can," I told him. "Sella takes the next watch in an hour." "Can't," he said quietly, staring into the fire. "Too much adrenaline still working through me, I think. Mind if I keep you company instead?" I did not mind. We sat together in silence for a while, listening to the fire crack and the distant, unfamiliar sounds of the moon's nightlife settling back into whatever passed for normal after the disruption we had caused. Eventually, Cole spoke again, his voice low so as not to wake the others. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Something that's been on my mind since the marsh." "Go ahead," I said. "Does it bother you," he asked, "that so much of what you built your career on turned out to be incomplete? I don't mean that as an insult, I promise. I just wonder how that sits with someone who spent this many years being the expert in the room." I considered the question honestly before answering, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. "It did bother me, at first," I admitted. "I have spent 11 cycles believing that if I cataloged enough hazards thoroughly enough, I could keep every recruit who passed through my training safe from the dangers of any world we sent them to. Discovering that an entire species existed whose relationship with those same hazards did not fit my framework at all felt, for a short time, like discovering the foundation of my work was less solid than I believed." "And now," he asked, "now I think incomplete knowledge, honestly examined and corrected, is simply what learning looks like when it is done properly," I said. "I would rather understand that my index has limits and expand it accordingly than continue teaching something false out of pride. You and your species did not break my understanding of danger, Cole. You expanded it. There is a difference, and I did not always know that difference as clearly as I do now." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something gentler than the confident, easy tone I had grown used to hearing from him. "That's a pretty generous way to look at it, coming from someone who almost lost a recruit to a flower because of a listing you wrote yourself." "I have thought about that more than you know," I admitted. "But Onyx is alive because you happened to be there, and because I was willing to trust something I could not fully verify in the moment it mattered most. I do not know that I would have made that same choice before this season began. I think I would have hesitated too long, trusting the index over the recruit standing in front of me." "Well," he said, a small, tired smile crossing his face. "Glad I could help update the record then, even if it took a crash landing and a predator to really drive the point home." We sat together until Sella woke for her watch, and though neither of us spoke much after that, I found the silence between us comfortable in a way it had not been at the start of that long, difficult night. The creature did not return before dawn, though we kept watch in shifts until the sky began to lighten with the moon's slow morning light. Corvin's communications work, aided by Onyx's steady hands once his cut had been treated, finally managed to boost our distress signal enough to reach the outer edge of the base's monitoring range sometime near morning, and by midday, a rescue shuttle broke through the atmosphere, guided in by the beacon we had rigged from salvaged parts, and no small amount of determination. I remember the walk back to the rescue shuttle more clearly than almost anything else from that entire assignment, the whole group of us, exhausted, bruised, filthy, and entirely gratefully alive, Cole walking beside me with the waxy blue leaves still tucked into his jacket pocket. "Saved for later use," he told me, "because you never knew when a good plant might come in handy again." Back at base, once Corvin's leg had been properly set and the rest of us had been cleared by Dr. Nair after a thorough examination, I sat down and did something I had never done in 11 cycles of teaching survival. I opened the Base Hazard Index, the document I had spent years building and defending as an absolute, unmovable truth, and I created an entirely new section within it, one I titled simply, exceptions, and context. I wrote about the nerve leaf that numbed a jaw for 6 hours in most species, but seasoned a human meal. I wrote about the marsh flower, whose toxin had nearly cost Onyx his life, and the unassuming purple-stemmed plant that had saved it, remembered from a childhood on an entirely different world. I wrote about the fermented beverages, the toxic root turned staple food, the bitter seed turned into something humans gave as gifts, and the rust-colored berries that had, against every rule I had ever taught, become a weapon in a moment of genuine crisis, rather than a threat. Danger, I wrote, is not a fixed property of a substance. It is a relationship between a body and the world around it, shaped by evolution, by culture, by generations of trial and memory passed down until knowledge stops looking like knowledge and starts looking like instinct. What one species must avoid at all costs, another may cultivate, refine, and eventually celebrate. Every hazard listing in this index reflects the boundaries of the species it was tested against, and no listing should be treated as universal until proven so directly. I found Cole later that evening, sitting outside the barracks with Sella, Onyx, and Grace, the four of them laughing quietly about something, already sounding lighter than the exhaustion of the previous days should have allowed. I approached with something in my hands, a small, sealed container I had prepared earlier that afternoon. "Instructor," Cole said, straightening slightly as I approached, the others quieting out of habit more than actual concern. "I have a request," I said, setting the container down between us. "Not an order, a request. I would like you to teach me. Not survival technique, I have enough of that. I want to understand how your species built this relationship with danger, how you turned poison into food and threat into remedy, generation after generation, until it became simply who you are. I suspect there is more to learn from your people than I have learned in 11 cycles of cataloging hazards the way I always assumed hazards worked." Cole looked at the container, then at me, and something in his expression shifted into genuine warmth. "What's in the box?" he asked. "Samples," I admitted. "From the base kitchen archive. I am told humans occasionally season food with something you call pepper. I would like to understand why." He laughed, a real full laugh that drew a smile even from Onyx, still nursing the last of his healing cut. "Careful what you wish for, sir. Once you start, it's genuinely hard to stop." I sat down among them as the moon's twin suns dipped below the horizon, and for the first time in 11 cycles, I found myself not teaching a lesson, but learning one, from a species that had looked at every danger the universe offered, and instead of simply avoiding it, had decided, patiently, stubbornly, over thousands of years, to make it theirs.